Hi, everybody. It's Julie Roginsky and Emily DeCiccio coming to you on the Saltier Politics podcast. Emily, it's been a while since we actually explained to people who we are and why we're doing this podcast, so I think it's a good idea to refresh people's memories. You and I met when we were working at Fox News.
We met when I was first a writer on Outnumbered, and I actually remember seeing your Twitter because you were the only Democrat on, and you would just get these ridiculous trolls telling you awful things, but you would have these comebacks that were perfection and just the amount that a tweet is. And then when I got a new job at Fox, I pitched a show, The Clapback, with you, so you'd have more of a platform to do these hilariously biting clapbacks, but talk them out. And it worked, and we made it a show, and it was really fun.
And we got away with it, which is unbelievable because we basically had the run of the show to do whatever we wanted, which is essentially mock everybody, and to the point where I believe even the Russian embassy got in on the action, or the consulate, and got really angry at us about a couple of segments we did clapping back at Vladimir Putin. So we decided to take all of that action and make it into a podcast. But what I think I love about our podcast, now that we've done it for I don't know, 6 months or however long it's been, is that we're actually able to talk about things much more in depth than you can on a TV show, certainly. But typically when you interview authors, or when you have authors interviewed, as we do so often on this show, people don't really have the opportunity to read their books before they interview them, which I think makes for a much less informed interview. So you and I had this policy from day one that if we were going to have an author on, as we do this week, to talk about their books, that we were actually going to read their books and really analyze them beforehand so that we could have a really informed discussion. And I'm so happy to say that we did that again this week when we had Noah Rothman on, who wrote a book called Unjust, a book that you and I profoundly don't agree with much, but I think it made for incredibly interesting discussion. And Noah had some of you may have seen a very contentious interview on Morning Joe right before he came and did the interview with us. And I thought that was a great interview where he really got into it with another panelist on Morning Joe. But what was interesting about that is, of course, on a TV show, you only can argue until the next commercial break, which I and you know both so well from having done TV for so many years. We were able to have a really good discussion and an argument with him on this show, on our show, that lasted for, I don't know, a good 45 minutes. And it was great. And we really went at it. And I learned a lot. And I think people would too once they listened to it. So
we did not have a commercial break, and we had vodka. So it was a great discussion.
It was a wonderful discussion. I hope you guys enjoy it. So coming up, Noah Rothman.
Welcome to Saltier Politics. Noah, tell us about your new book.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. My book is called Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. It is an adversarial take on social justice activism in its modern forms. A lot of people who maybe only have casual exposure to social justice activism might think it's a pretty anodyne and unobjectionable concept. It's simply a way to think about fairness and equality in a just society, rectifying historical grievances, and what could be more American than that? In the hands of its activist class, however, it has become the antithesis of blind objective justice, the kind of thing we seek in a courtroom. It forces its adherents to embrace discriminatory policies. It radicalizes them. It confuses them about what politics is capable of in this country, and when their expectations go unmet, it renders them violent. That is the thesis of this book. I explore it, I describe it, and I identify some of the ways in which you can see it in the wild, and you can stigmatize these ideas because I think they're particularly dangerous.
And cheers, by the way. By the way, I'm so happy to say that Noah Rothman we finally found a guest who drinks what I drink, which is a Grey Goose martini. So for once, we actually have somebody who's not insisting on making me drink brown, disgusting liquor.
The Philistines that you have.
They're awful. I mean, Kornacki still takes the cake for making us drink Bud Light, but this is the drink of choice for me, at least. So thank you, Noah.
Kornacki is a man of the people. I am a feat.
You are a feat, and I thank you for being a feat. But what you're saying in your book, essentially, is that social justice has essentially become reverse discrimination, right? That in some ways, by discriminating, by trying to create either affirmative action programs or other specialized programs for minorities or women or for other classes that want social justice, that in some ways you're rendering the opposite effect for those that it's leaving behind.
So social justice as a concept arose out of the Catholic Church in the 19th century. It was sort of a way for you to just think about charity and your obligations to your fellow man. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, John Rawls put a lot of meat on these bones. He talked about how there were historical grievances, objectified and marginalized people, and the way to affect social justice was to create institutions that were dedicated to social leveling, positive and negative. And the only way to do that in a just and fair way was for an enlightened distributor to distribute justice as though it were a finite commodity, but to do so from behind a veil of ignorance, so that his personal biases could not be satisfied by this distribution. Modern social justice activists on the right and the left, it's not a phenomenon exclusive to the left, although it's primarily on the left, have nothing to do with this veil of ignorance. They think it's counterproductive to the design of meting out true justice. How can you mete out historical justice if you have no idea who the oppressed are, who the oppressors are, who deserves to be lifted up, and who should be tamped down a little bit? So they abandon Rawls. They abandon the kind of social justice and fairness and equality that you think social justice is dedicated to, in favor of something that's much more capricious, much more arbitrary, and certainly identifies, as you say, discrimination, treating individuals unequally in order to achieve equality. And as Frederick Hayek demonstrated in a very expansive response to John Rawls, there is no justice in that.
Well, let's talk about something you and I agree on first, and then we can jump in and we can talk about areas where Emily and you disagree, and certainly you and I disagree, and others as well. You talk a lot about the campus phenomenon, which drives me absolutely batty, of having safe spaces or having kids. I'll take that even further. Trigger warnings on books that you should be triggered by. That's the whole reason you read great literature. I just recommended to somebody that they read Lolita, which I think is an amazing book, but I suspect that would get a big trigger warning these days from people who think it's about pedophilia, whereas in fact I think it's a great work of art. And I can go down the list of books that are great works of art that should a priori not have a trigger warning because of the fact that you don't know what to expect until you actually read the book.
Or that you would just experience as discomfort, maybe,
right,
as opposed to trauma.
Exactly. And safe spaces, which I think are pretty preposterous, and I agree with you on that, for minorities or for anybody else, because the whole point is not to self-segregate, right? So I agree with you tremendously on that. Emily, I don't know if you disagree, but you went to college a lot more recently than I did.
Right. So I went to the bastion of the liberal. I went to Brown, and where intersectionality and safe spaces were a big thing, and it's the first time I learned a lot about safe spaces and stuff like that. However, I do agree people need to be put in uncomfortable situations and learn how to deal with other people. But for example, being a member of the LGBTQ class, not be looked at as a sexual object by men, is sometimes what you need, and why gay bars are, for example, so important. And to have at least the option of those spaces, especially in this day and age when there is still discrimination, it's important.
Certainly. So to take both those points, let's start with yours. So intersectionality as an academic idea is completely unobjectionable. It is a perfectly valid way to understand how prejudice works in the United States and elsewhere. As a working theory for a political constituency, for establishing political coalitions, it is self-defeating. This book is not about objecting to colorblindness in your own life. The notion that colorblindness or anti-discrimination, for example, the notion that you should operate in your life without any regard for individual personal experiences of which you may not have any idea about, is an argument in favor of ignorance, and I'm not arguing that. What I am arguing is that institutional discrimination, which is the object of this philosophy, is antithetical to the American experience. Even though you might think it's a good idea, it's simply impossible to realize. It cannot be done. The institutions that we have in this country are resistant to it to the point that will frustrate the activists who believe that is a moral imperative, to a point where they will react in one of two ways. One, they'll disengage. They'll say, throw up their hands. This existential moral imperative of mine is not being met by these institutions to the degree of my satisfaction, so I'm going to disengage. The second is to radicalize and to resolve to attack the foundational pillars of these institutions because they are morally reprehensible, and that results in street violence. And we've seen more and more of it in this decade, and I think that's a trend.
But don't you think, you are a white kid, and so am I, by the way, from New Jersey, who grew up, I assume, in a middle class upbringing. And so you and I both apply to Harvard, and we either get in or don't get in the merits, right? And then there is an African-American child who did not have the same access to education, did not have the same access to money, did not have the same access to tutors, did not have the same access to all of the above. And so that person has incredible potential, and that person is exactly where you and I are, did exactly as well in the SATs, did exactly as well as you and I did with his grades. Don't you think that person, by virtue of the fact that they have no other escape potentially from their lives other than through education, for example, that person should receive some sort of special benefit when they apply to college?
So briefly, the argument that I hear the most from people who are hostile to this is that you do not have the requisite experience to opine on these issues with any authority. And it is true that while, however, I have a blindingly Jewish last name, and people who do have experienced bigotry in this country, it is not the argument that I'm making that I am talking to you as something. I am not coming to you as a Jewish, Irish, heterosexual male from New Jersey. I am reciting what I understand to be the ideals at the heart of the American founding. And ideals are just that, ideals. We live up to them. We somehow always, live up to them, but may not necessarily reach our aspirations, but they are aspirational nonetheless. At the Harvard case is an interesting one. So let's take something that is actually before the courts right now, which is institutional discrimination, negative discrimination, not positive discrimination, not affirmative action, negative discrimination against Asian Americans, right. Appealing to stereotypes. The people who defend these policies, who say that Asian Americans are overrepresented in higher institutions of higher learning, defend these policies in, for example, the New York Times opinion page by appealing to stereotypes. Asian Americans come from stable homes. They have a family culture that incentivizes and rewards studying. They are hardworking people. All these stereotypes. It necessitates seeing people not as individuals, but as members of classes and tribes. Some of those tribes deserve special treatment, and some of those tribes deserve to do a comeuppance. And this is a toxic way of viewing things, and it's fundamentally impossible to achieve in a fashion that is not capricious, not arbitrary, and does not create more prejudice and discrimination than it seeks to resolve.
But I think in reality, look, on paper, you're absolutely right. If this were a society where you're starting from scratch, it's a meritocracy, everybody gets to go where they go by virtue of being the person most meritorious to get that position. But in reality, it is true that there are certain groups of people who've had a little bit harder than other groups of people over the course of our history, including today.
Of course.
And so as a result of that, look, I have a blonde 6-year-old boy. I don't worry about him walking down the street and being shot by cops. I just don't. Mm-hmm. If he were not a blonde white boy, if he were an African-American boy, I would probably have a different conversation with him in a couple of years. And that's just reality. That's not how we want it to be, but that's exactly what we all fear. And why is it that that person and that group of people, why can't we at least acknowledge that society as a whole has not treated them based on merit, in fact, has discriminated against them throughout history? And as a result, because of that discrimination that's inherent, and that discrimination which has been historic, that those people deserve to have at least a little bit of a leg up when it comes to trying to get into the meritocracy discussion that we as white people are all entitled to have.
Well, respectfully, you said that on paper my argument makes sense, but in reality it's a little more complicated. But the situation you presented me with is entirely theoretical, is that it postulates individuals who are hypotheticals, who are dealing with circumstances that I don't think, frankly, mirror my experience. I'm certainly going to be having a talk with my children about being respectful towards police.
Well, it's
and
a different
the behavior
conversation.
in which
some kids are respectful towards police and therefore still get shot or don't get shot because of the color of their skin.
Absolutely, and there is institutional discrimination. We can be honest about that. There is racism in this country. There's bigotry. There's homophobia. All of that is real. The prescriptions that the social justice movement has described and has applied to these situations, we can observe with some objectivity because they've been tried in the real world now for some time. And as we said in the prior conversation, that positive discrimination, affirmative action, is no longer the point. It is negative discrimination, more often than not, from the classes of people that I speak to who are social justice advocates, who say that this certain class is due a comeuppance. It's a toxic grievance philosophy.
I see your point, but I feel that also it's a weighing of, here's another one for you, what the microaggression that a lot of the minority classes have to go through every day. For example, a walk to school. Your son walking to school versus a black female woman. First, not only does she have to worry about her safety, about sexual safety, but then it's about being black and then being treated a certain way. So before you get to school, before you start learning, you already have all these little things weighing on your mind. And then that builds every single day, because something that your son's not even thinking about, me walking, or, a minority woman walking to the same school already has all of these things that she's thinking of. So it's not only now I'm going to school to learn, but I'm going to school to learn on top of all these things.
And I think also to the point that you said it's a reverse discrimination because I want mine, but you can't have yours. In reality, I'm going to use Harvard again as an example. They're going to admit, I don't know, whatever it is, X number of people. So your spot will be taken up by somebody if you don't get in. So it's not that they're going to admit both you and me, or you and an African-American student. They're going to admit somebody and therefore not admit somebody else. So what you look at as reverse discrimination, I look at as, would you not give an opportunity to two people who are exactly the same based on merit, but to say that if you give this opportunity, it doesn't have to be an African-American, it could be some white poor kid from Appalachia who grew up in a horrible environment, and this is his ticket out of this horrible, self-sustaining, self-repetitive situation that's gone on for generations. Why not give that person a little bit of a leg up to ensure that he and people like him finally get out of the cycle of poverty or the cycle of discrimination or whatever you might call it?
Because I am not John Rawls' enlightened distributor. I do not have the requisite capacity, nor do I think anybody else does, to serve as this executor of cosmic, karmic justice. It is capricious, it is arbitrary, it is impossible to perform in a way that is accepting of the merit of the individual applicants. And in order to do this, in order to deem yourself John Rawls' distributor, you have to adopt a certain level of hubris that will inevitably create more grievances. You are no longer judging things by a certain level of merit. You are inculcating in the discriminated against a grievance philosophy, which is perfectly legitimate in my view. And that necessitates more conflict over generations.
But don't you think the people who are already in the establishment, the people who have already made it, there's been studies about this, tend to hire people like them, right? So there's the quote-unquote Jewish law firm. There's the quote-unquote Italian law firm. And that unless there's some sort of prodding or some sort of mentality, that you will just keep perpetuating the cycle of people who are currently left out, continuing to be left out for generation after generation. You certainly have seen that with African Americans. And people who have already made it continuing to empower people like themselves going forward.
And people who study statistical analysis do identify racial grievance as part of statistical algorithmic outputs. Because an algorithm is only as good as the input that it puts in, and humans are prone to error, and humans are prone to racism, and they put that into the system. The answer to that kind of prejudice, and it is prejudice, is not to apply more prejudice, is not to perpetuate an inequality.
I don't think it's prejudice, though. I think it's maybe opening people up to more empathy.
Empathy's good.
I mean, I would take some of the...
I guess my question about that is, you acknowledge that racism exists, right? I mean,
of course.
It's a fact. You acknowledge that sexism exists. You acknowledge that all these evils exist or whatever they are. What's the remedy?
Oh, I don't have a remedy. I'm certainly not bold enough and not enamored enough with my own intellect to say I have a remedy for human foibles like prejudice.
But you don't think that this, whether I'm using affirmative action as an example, but it's just one of many examples, the fact that it used to be, I just remember when I was first starting out in politics, I think this was 25 years ago, I was one of the very, very few women in politics. And sure enough, it then became politically unpalatable that you didn't have too many women on staff as your chief of staff in the Senate or running your campaigns or whatever it is. And so I think politicians, whether they like to or not, decided they were going to bring more women on. I'm not saying the women were more qualified than the men they would have hired, but it became sort of socially unacceptable not to be able to have more women on your campaign or working in your Senate office. If you don't do things like that, if society is not pushing you to include marginalized classes like that,
right,
whether through laws or just through public shaming, for lack of a better word, then what?
Well, no, that's a very big difference. It's not whether through laws or whether through social stigma. Social stigma is the ideal. Laws and institutions that will mete out penalties for failing to adhere to these guidelines are flawed and injurious to individuals. Creating social stigma and establishing social guidelines and mores that people can appeal to is how society evolves and develops. And you just described how an evolutionary process towards greater equality. That's good. That's something we should all admire and adhere to. Individuals, for example, who use, and I talk about this in the book, who use the realities, and they are realities, of genetic distribution of chromosomes when you are born either male or female, can use that to make somebody feel really bad about themselves if they don't identify as male or female. That person is a jerk, and he should be made to feel like a jerk. And he should be made to feel like saying that sort of thing out loud will result in negative consequences. That's how we stigmatize behavior. It's not the province of the state to address offense. It is not the province of the state to make somebody feel better about themselves or to punish somebody who is being a jerk just because they are a jerk.
What about hate crimes?
Well, hate crimes are crimes.
So there's
Just
no,
like social justice doesn't exist.
So there's no
only
distinction.
justice.
So for example, when you have a gay kid 20 years ago who's beaten and basically crucified like a scarecrow in Montana, and that became a rallying cry for why hate crimes for the LGBT community or somebody else need to be developed. It doesn't matter that it's somebody who was killed primarily or exclusively because that person was gay. It's just that he was killed and that person should be tried like any other killer.
Yeah, I don't take a particular position on hate crime legislation. It is the province of individual states as to whether or not they feel
But
like
it is
it's the way to go.
institutional. But it is institutional discrimination or not, isn't it? I mean, that's basically what you're saying.
How is it institutional
Well,
discrimination?
the institution decides that a special class of citizen gets a special protection, so that.
Well, they don't really. They say that there's a special punishment for that sort of crime. It's not as though they're
but
special
if I punch you in the face, I get whatever penalty I get, right? But if I punch you in the face while screaming horrible epithets against you for being gay or for being black or something else, then I get whatever punishment I would get for punching you in the face, plus an extra X number of months or years for committing that crime because it's quote unquote a hate crime. So that's an institutional decision. Is that something that you disagree with as well?
No, I don't. I don't see many deleterious effects on this social compact from excessive penalties for different crimes that happen to be committed by somebody we believe may have racial prejudices. The problem, though, is that you have to determine whether or not someone has racial prejudices.
Well, they could be screaming, they can be calling you horrible names and the N-word or the F-word or whatever else they could be calling you where it's clear why. So if you're okay with that and that's an institutional decision, why wouldn't you be okay with other institutional remedies?
Well, that doesn't create negative discrimination.
Sure it does, because if I'm a straight woman, if I get punched in the face, the person who punches me in the face is not, I'm not going to get...
How are you disenfranchised because that's not a hate crime?
I'm disenfranchised in the sense that I guess your punishment for hitting somebody who's gay is not the same as your punishment for hitting me. And we both suffer the same trauma physically. So
I suppose.
So what's the difference? Taking it to its logical conclusion, if you're not discriminating against people that way, why would you be discriminating against people negatively in any other way?
Well, I don't see any opportunity that's been denied. Again, maybe I'm simply being obtuse and not seeing it, but I don't see the opportunity that's being denied somebody who is deserving that the state is robbing you.
I guess I'm not getting the same justice as a straight woman that a gay woman might get, right? From my perspective, that a gay woman, if we both got punched in the face similarly, the person that did it to me gets a year, the person that did it to her gets 5 years.
I suppose it's an interesting hypothetical. I don't necessarily disagree with you, and I don't find that to be particularly injurious to the social fabric. But again, that's not really the kind of social justice that I think is Rawlsian in nature, and certainly not what the activist class is particularly excised about.
When you have people marching in the streets with tiki torches, screaming, "Jews will not replace us," and you're Jewish and so am I, and we certainly know the history of our people and the discrimination that we face historically. It occurs to me that while it's a wonderful notion to say that institutions should be colorblind and gender blind and everything else, the reality is that institutions have so historically benefited a certain group of people that why wouldn't we help people a little bit more?
So it's strange to me, though. You're describing now the threat posed by white supremacist, white nationalist ideology. And then I hear from social justice advocates that meritocracy is a myth, that agency is essentially a lie, that your course on life is essentially predestined by your accidents of birth, that separatism is not really a bad thing explicitly to prevent social discomfort, and that colorblindness is a myth. at best, and naive, and maybe a little dangerous at worst. This is exactly what the white nationalist right believes. That's exactly what white supremacists believe. They're mirror images of one another, and they don't seem to look at each other as though.
But I wouldn't confuse separatism with anything else that I've said, right? I agree with you on separatism in the sense that, look, I think, for example, we grow up in a very, very, very segregated society when we're growing up. You go to schools with people who happen to have the money to buy real estate in the same communities that you do, and therefore a lot of people go through high school not seeing anybody who doesn't look like them or is not of the same affluent class as they are, or so on and so forth. Then you get to college, and hopefully, if the college admissions office does a good job, they have a cross-section of people who are probably equally as talented, hopefully equally as talented. Why don't you want a more diffuse and diverse group of people to be with each other? And therefore, why don't you allow colleges, for example, to then reach into communities that otherwise would not be exposed to admissions, to take people from those communities, to try to diversify the pool of people so that eventually nobody thinks it's weird to see two women kissing each other, or to see two African Americans holding hands on college campus, or to see an African American woman and a white man dating, or any of that stuff. Why not try to do that?
And it's outside the scope of my book, frankly. But for me personally, I just think that's a little bit beyond the mission statement of an academic institution. An academic institution is designed to merit individuals who deserve it and to advance them and to educate them. It's not necessarily a place for socialization. That's a secondary phenomenon.
Well, except that we all know the ticket out of poverty is exactly that. It's academic institutions.
Which is precisely why it's completely bizarre that we'd be discriminating against Asian American immigrants.
I don't disagree.
Institutionally, that the government is suing over this. And the Obama administration did not join that suit.
I don't disagree. But what I do disagree about, I guess, is that to me, what struck me in your book is, despite the fact that I do agree with a lot of it, you try to apply what I think are wonderful intentions to a world that is not as black and white as I think you like it to be, right? So that while it would be wonderful for us to all be based on our SAT, I got a 1600, you got a 1600, Emily got a 1500, and therefore you and I go to college and Emily doesn't go to the same school on our SATs. The reality is there may be reasons for why Emily didn't do as well as you and I did. And maybe that she grew up in some trailer in Florida and therefore didn't have access to the same tutors that you and I did.
Well, okay, so I would pose to you the same question that you were posing to me, based on a hypothetical notion that an individual who suffers the same physical assault and who is gay and one who is not will receive more justice, quote unquote, from the system, because the individual who attacked her is liable for sentencing guidelines that are a little more stringent than the other way around. So why is let's say, a hypothetical individual from Chinatown with immigrant parents who scored perfectly on their SATs doesn't match the idea that you think is necessary for proper socialization in institutions of higher learning?
I would say that
just because there's too many of her?
No, not because there's too many of her. I would have to take a look at her background versus the background of somebody who
Precisely. That is precisely what I am saying.
But
we have to treat people as individuals because anything else is arbitrary and capricious and hubristic. We simply do not have the information necessary to make that decision about classes of people.
But you're still institutionally making the decision. So, for example, here's where I would agree with you. I would say that if I were a college admissions officer, and we can get off the college admissions in a second, but if I were a college admissions officer and I were choosing between two candidates, right, who are equally impressive. One of them is the daughter of an African-American partner at Jones Day, one of the biggest law firms in the country, and grew up going to private school in New York with tutors and extracurriculars and all the wonderful things that you have when you have money, right? The other is a white boy from Appalachia. I would say to you, don't take the African-American girl, take the white boy, right, from Appalachia, because he needs, assuming they're both exactly where they are academically, and you have to choose between one of the two, take the white boy from Appalachia, because clearly he needs a leg up, or a little bit of a hand up. And the question...
Positive discrimination.
Well, the question you're obviously you're then discriminating against the black girl, right?
But the thing is that I'm interrupting you. I apologize. We can just get back to that. But I just want to linger on that for a minute, because positive discrimination is one thing. And I'm not institutionally predisposed to say that's a really horrible thing, because there are prejudices and there are historical grievances that society is obliged to do its best to rectify. But it's no longer the point to simply rely on the positive discrimination for the activist class and sort of sotto voce dismiss the negative discriminatory aspects of that as collateral damage. It is no longer the point. The point is to identify individuals who are members of classes and tribes who have been historically members of a privileged class, and to rob them of that privilege that they are enjoying whether they know it or not. That, to me, is a discriminatory impulse that stems from a psychological place that is very injurious, not only to the social compact, but to you personally and your psychological outlook.
So you don't have a problem with discrimination, or negative discrimination as you call it. You don't have a problem with that, provided it's on an individual level. You just don't want it to apply to classes of people. That's essentially a good place to start.
Okay.
What I am arguing in this book is that the philosophy of the social justice left and the white nationalist right is that your accidents of birth and the member of and the class and the tribe that they place you in are the basis upon which we can apply sweeping judgments about your course in life and what you are due. And that to me is inherently discriminatory.
But don't you? Sorry, Emily. But don't you see that that has determined it? I mean, this country.
Yes, but again, the answer to the cure to the ills of bigotry is not more bigotry. Then
what? What is the cure? That's what I keep asking you, is the expansion of opportunity.
I do not have the cure, but I do have the answer to the notion that we are enlightened enough, we are hubristic enough to identify what somebody in their life is due, and that is to say, you do not. We simply do not have the inputs necessary to make that judgment about complex individuals. Individuals must be judged on their own individual merits. There is no other uniform way to apply the benefits of society. We're not equipped to make that enlightened judgment.
And if somebody doesn't have the access to receive those merits or be as meritorious because of their accident of birth, that's just something you want to discount.
No, like I said, I simply cannot. I don't think we can judge that in a collective way. That's fair. I just don't think we have the ability to judge collective groups that way, in a fair way, without creating the kind of collateral damage that social justice activists would wave off, again, as though it's some sort of, or just an outgrowth of necessary progress and enlightenment.
But statistically, African American families are poorer. Statistically, African American families don't have as much access to education. Statistically, there is ingrained institutional racism that has followed African Americans and others, but I'll use African Americans as an example, historically for the last 200, 300, 400 years. So it's not, I think it's a little simplistic to say, well, we can't look at it collectively. We know collectively there have been studies after study that show that African Americans are just not as advantaged as white people. And that, in fact, if you look at a resume from somebody, if they have this quote unquote African American name, that person will not be hired. Right. As somebody whose name is Noah Rothman, despite the fact that Noah Rothman and this African-American person have the exact same qualifications, the exact same resume. When you have ingrained bias like that in institutions, whether it's academic institutions or the workplace or government or anywhere else, how is it that you don't think of a remedy before saying, let's throw out the remedies that already exist? Because if you throw out the remedies that already exist, all that results in is going back 30, 40, 50 years where African Americans, again, don't have access to rise as much as they do now.
Well, I would challenge the notion that we've applied any remedies at all, at least in a governmental institutional sense. There has been progress in terms of, for African Americans, home ownership, individual wealth. The wealth gap was closing right before the collapse of the housing market. It is again closing now. There has been progress. There has been progress over the last 50 years. 50 years ago, the 101st Airborne was enforcing the desegregation of schools in American streets. We've improved as far as progress goes. I would challenge the notion that governing institutions, are responsible for that progress. That's more a societal evolution.
Not at all. Governmental institutions preclude you from discriminating against people based on gender or discriminating against people based on race. And so, for example, Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey who just announced his run for president, talks very clearly about the fact that his parents, who were black professionals, looked to buy a house in Harrington Park in New Jersey, which is a fairly affluent white community, when Booker was a little boy, and that they were not allowed to do that until a white family came in and were sort of their proxy home buyers. That's not allowed today. The government has ensured that's not allowed today. That is institutional decision-making that has precluded that. Desegregation was not because society was shamed into it. It was because the government insisted that we
I
had
don't think that's
desegregation.
true. No, it's just that the kind of consensus that resulted in those anti-discriminatory laws was the result of a societal shaming process, most certainly.
Those little black kids who walked into school in Alabama or walked into school in Arkansas under armed guard did it not because society somehow shamed white people into allowing them in. They did it because the Justice Department insisted that they be allowed to study there.
Right.
That's not societal shaming. And then you had the whole busing incident where white families would start busing.
How is the consensus built around in order to affect these changes?
The consensus was not built around this. I mean, the government was way ahead of society down south when they insisted that white people and black people go to school together. Brown versus Board of Education was something that came down from on high, from the Supreme Court, not because society in Alabama or society in Mississippi or Arkansas decided that suddenly, lo and behold, black kids and white kids should be in the same schools. In Boston, in the 70s, you had people who were literally pulling their kids out of public school because they're insisting on busing black kids into white neighborhoods to go to school. And society was incredibly, there were riots in Boston based on this. I don't want to just say the South was not involved in this. Boston, Massachusetts was not involved in this. Society was not involved.
No,
The
urban North is segregated.
Yeah,
in
I
many
mean,
ways.
I went to college in Boston.
Back in the
It's
day.
it's incredibly segregated. So I would say that it's because institutions insisted on it, not because society came around to this way of thinking. Society came around to this way of thinking long after institutions insisted. Loving versus Virginia, where you had the first interracial marriage in the 60s.
That is
They
precisely
almost
what I
got,
identify.
I mean, they almost got lynched. And the reality is that it's institutions and governmental institutions that insisted on this. Society was way behind this.
Right, and that's restorative justice, and in a more sort of a consensus that I think that you and I agree exists in these governing institutions has to be supported at a certain level by society. You suggest that there's absolutely no consensus around the imposition of this kind of restorative justice, and I just frankly don't think that's supported. That the government would have been able to execute the kind of very damaging and disorienting policies that you say that distorted the social fabric in these individual locales. If there wasn't a national consensus that would support those changes,
But there just wasn't societal consensus on this. You know this because we've all studied history. We've all seen the pictures of these little black kids, this little black girl, Ruby, I forgot her last name, I'm ashamed to say, walking into a school under armed guard and white people, literally white women, throwing tomatoes at her.
and it is the contention of many social activists to whom I've spoken with that there really isn't a whole lot of difference between that America and this America. That the institutional racism that prevailed then prevails now. It's just a little under the surface.
Well, I listen, I would argue that there's no school in the world that would, or in this country at least, that would preclude a white student from studying with a black student. I don't care how racist the people in that community are. They're just not allowed to do it, right? You're not allowed to discriminate against LGBT people in housing anymore. You're not allowed to do that with race either. Those are all governmental institutional decisions that were made.
And these laws were only on the books. They weren't applied generally until there was societal consensus around applying them.
Not necessarily. I mean, there are plenty of. I look at I wasn't around for the civil rights movement in the 60s, but I certainly was around for the LGBT movement in the last 20, 25 years. And I would say the laws caught up with where I think justice is way before society did. And
I would say the opposite, particularly when it comes to women. Discriminating against women was made illegal in 1963. Do we think that women had it better in 1963 than they do today? No. Or was the promise of anti-discrimination laws in the 1960s realized that minute? No. It took quite a long time in order for us to, and we're still living up to those ideals, but it's the law perhaps made illegal certain behaviors that should have been illegal and deserve to be illegal, but institutional discrimination persists, and it's society that is enforcing the stigmatization around negating those laws.
What I don't agree with you is when you think that the government has no remedy in fixing some of these ills.
I think that the government has no place in fixing some of these ills. I think it needs to be led by society, not the other way around. Generally, I think that's the dividing line.
And I think that's where we disagree.
But I think that the people leading society right now are still white men. And that's the problem I feel that a lot of the activist class has, because we want change now and don't want something that's going to take 10 years. I don't want marriage equality in 10 years. I want it now. And I've been waiting for how long for it. And I think it's just that push, because I feel like for all of American history that white men have had time. They have been the ones to control time and when things get enacted and when things... And you're seeing that control of time. For example, it hurts people negatively. Black neighborhoods have let people who live in neighborhoods that are mostly black have a shorter life expectancy. So we don't have the time to wait. It's I think now with all this new language, intersectionality, all of it, people now know how to identify an issue and are able to now push for it more. Whereas opposed to 10, 15 years ago, they wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, I think we just disagree on the proper remedy to how to get to that consensus. That imposition from above, and particularly negative discrimination against individuals who are perceived to have been enjoying privileges that they may or may not be aware of based on historical circumstances, is not a way to form lasting coalitions. And you talk about hostility towards same-sex marriage. I mean, the rapidity with which public opinion changed on that issue over the last 10, 15 years has been pretty remarkable. It's still not law. Nobody passed a law. The Supreme Court simply looked into the 14th Amendment and decided the 14th Amendment guaranteed this. That is the result not of an exigent reading of the Constitution, but of a societal shift, a shift in general public opinion towards this, that somebody found in the penumbra of the Constitution this right that was always there. And that has nothing to do with law, but that has everything to do with societal consensus.
I don't know about that. The Supreme Court decided that this was the law of the land, right? That you're allowed to do this. Congress did not pass a law about this, but the Supreme Court, as you said, looked into it and said that this is actually something that should be done. There are still places all over the country where that's completely antithetical to people, right? So those of us living in New York have, I think, largely no problem with two people of the same gender getting married.
And it should be law, by the way. The fact that this was a right that was just found in the Constitution is a bit of a shortcut.
It should be law, but nevertheless, it now allows people all over the country to get married. And that's not... Had we waited for society to catch up, it would mean that people who are gay, for example, in New York, would be getting married in New York.
But we did. We did wait for society to catch up. They
but
caught
not
up.
Everywhere.
But it did, though, result in the legalization of same-sex marriage around the country as a result of societal shifts that exerted pressure on the lower courts, which sent it to the higher courts, which eventually landed in the Supreme Court in 2013. I mean, this sort of stuff wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. 15 years ago, we were discussing a constitutional amendment forbidding it.
Correct, but you also don't have Congress, as you just said, passing the law, right? So society hasn't caught up, because if society had caught up, Congress would have said this is absolutely
No,
civil
but
right.
I don't think that's fair. Congress is an extremely broken institution.
It is.
Congress is just a fundamentally at root broken institution. It no longer is a jealous guardian of its own authority. The Madisonian scheme has broken down. I don't think that has a lot to do with...
Well, I would disagree with you. I don't disagree with you on the role of Congress and what's happening there, but I would disagree with you that you can't apply unequal societal... That's why government is so important. They had desegregation for the most part here in the North. They didn't have it in the South. Society had not caught up with it yet when they desegregated the schools. Brown versus Board of Education, again, something that emanated from the Supreme Court, allowed that to be the law of the land, which meant that it applied in Topeka, Kansas, as much as it applied in New York.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. You can't wait for society in Topeka, Kansas to catch up.
Yeah, these are complicated issues, and I don't have all of the responses to them, obviously, and no silver bullets. One of the phenomena that I go through in the book is these sort of historical grievances, and it is the fact of the matter that Jim Crow was a product of the Reconstruction movement.
Right.
Reconstruction was injurious to a lot of the planter class, and the planter class rebelled. And that is the sort of thing that I think you can't separate one or the other. Retributive justice, the idea that you can establish groups and classes and mete out negative justice against them, regardless of their personal circumstances or their individual conditions, is something that you see in societies around the world that are recovering from a post-conflict condition. And they have to appeal to extrajudicial institutions for restorative mechanisms that often go outside the idea of what we would think would constitute sort of, objective justice meted out in a courtroom,
But
appeal to whole classes and groups. But it is a dangerous prospect, sometimes necessary, sometimes the sort of thing that you have to appeal to in order to achieve societal reconciliation, which I 100% agree with and understand. But you are necessarily flirting with the idea that you're creating grievances that span generations, that go beyond the idea of an individual as an individual, and it sees him more as a member of a class and a tribe. And that can have blowback effects.
Yes, but and I don't want to dwell on Jim Crow because now we're really getting far afield. But
Right.
I get that the planter class was unhappy with the way the war had
And
ended.
deserved a little retribution.
And deserved a little
And that was the radical
retribution.
Republican platform.
And the question is, had government not stepped in, and government did go overboard with Reconstruction, but had government not stepped, I shouldn't say government went overboard with Reconstruction. I think there are views of people who think that that's the case. But had government not stepped in, do you think the planter class would ever have allowed their former slaves?
Nope.
So then why not have government step in?
I didn't say we didn't or shouldn't.
Okay.
But that you are,
But that's a whole class of people that you're now empowering.
and that is a complicated, but it was a post-conflict society. The United States is not a post-conflict society today. We are not South Africa. We are not South Sudan. We are not the post-Civil War United States.
You don't see a direct line
No, I certainly do.
between what African Americans endured 150, almost 200 years ago in the Civil War and after the Civil
And
War.
how it manifests
and
today.
how it manifests today. Of
Absolutely.
Course.
Of course.
So then why don't you have restorative justice for them today the way you would have had it during Reconstruction 150 years ago?
Because the post-conflict society model, the extrajudicial institutional model, creates negative consequences, collateral damage, and the collateral damage doesn't simply go away. It manifests in grievances that span generations. And that's the sort of thing that I observed when I went over into Ukraine and I began the book about it,
Right.
about how these are grievances that will never go away because they are being meted out against whole classes. And those whole classes will hold onto those grievances for the rest of their lives, and they'll pass them on to their children. And that's what we're dealing with today in many ways. But the answer to addressing those kind of grievances that were sown generations ago is not to create more generations of grievances that will follow us and our children and our children's children.
But what is the answer? Because if you get rid of affirmative action or all these, as you call, negative discrimination tactics.
Well, that's positive
Positive
discrimination.
discrimination tactics, excuse me. If you get rid of those, then who benefits? It's the same people who are the descendants of the white male planter class. And
Well, you don't think there's been any racial progress in this country?
I think it's been some racial progress. I don't think it's been enough.
Some?
I don't think it's been enough.
No, I don't think it's been enough. I don't think anybody would ever say it's enough, ever.
So then what's the problem with continuing to try to remedy it the way we have been? Because
I
if
think
because if you
again,
don't,
we're back to the fundamental disagreement between the two of us. So the extent to which you can say that this is responsible, the public sector is responsible for this, and private societal shifts are responsible for it.
okay. Let's move on for a second to something less weighty, unless Emily wants to add something.
Well, no, yeah, this is perfect. So for intersectionality, just to step back to that, where it was, and if I'm wrong, correct me, but because I really believe in intersectionality, like that I'm not quite the master of my own destiny in pointing out certain discriminations.
Well, you see that in the activists. I don't think that's necessarily a facet of intersectionality. What I described is just the political pitfalls of using that as an organizational philosophy for a political group as opposed to an academic tool for understanding how prejudice manifests in the world, which is, again, perfectly valid and pretty helpful. But as an institutional tool for creating political coalitions, again, you have to see what we talked about in the last segment. Excuse me. The notion, however, that you, based on your demographic traits, are compelled by virtue of the societal pressures around you to inhabit this matrix of prejudice, and to this unnavigable matrix of prejudice, by the way, which forces you to see yourself as in many ways a prisoner of these exigent circumstances of which you have no control, to view your neighbor as somebody who has a certain level of privilege or a certain level of victimization. It dehumanizes individuals. You don't think about these people as individuals, you think about them as their class.
So I feel that it empowers me. Being able to be like, okay, not only is, fighting a woman thing or a religion thing, but it may be both. So knowing what you're going up against, that it's not just you're in this class of woman, but then what else under that, I think that's empowering too. I think if it, not victimizing, I think you can use it and kind of switch it and use it as empowering and being able to identify with this language of intersectionality, that not only am I going to be going against this and this, the decks are a little stacked, but now I know, let's go for it.
I think the Women's March would certainly have, if they could do it over again, they would appeal a little less to an intersectional philosophy that forced them to look at their own members of their coalition, their organizing coalition, as various degrees of oppressor, because some of them happen to be white Jews, and some of them maybe were benefiting from white privilege or white supremacy or perpetuating white supremacy, in the words of Tamika Mallory, and that maybe they had to embrace somebody who is an absolute ridiculous anti-Semite and another one who is a cop killer, which reduced their utility to the political coalitions they were appealing to, just on a pragmatic level. They were trying to make themselves attractive to the Democratic Party as a core member of their coalition, and they ruined that by appealing to this intersectional philosophy. They lost power. They were no longer able to present themselves as this pragmatic, important part of this coalition. They were disempowered by this philosophy.
I think it was a learning experience, because seeing that, how black women, Hispanic women, other classes that just aren't white women are underrepresented, they might have messed up the first year, but that gives them something to build on.
Yeah, just I have to side with Noah on this one, because you do have people jumping off now and not doing the big women's march in DC because of the issues that you raised, and having separate women's marches, and it's become almost competing in terms of what they're trying to do. And it took away from the energy, I think, of the first women's march, which was essentially an anti-Donald Trump movement, right?
I'm going to be the hopeful optimist and say it's breaking up and it will rebuild stronger.
I hope you're right. Tell me, or tell us, about the fact that you were a drama major in school? Or no, what were you? Tell us something bizarre.
I went to college on a performing arts scholarship.
Right.
I was in, I think, 30 musical productions by the time I went to college. I was a musical theater nerd.
Wow.
Very musical and very theatrical.
Okay. Did you want to go be on Broadway?
No. But I did want to perform. I did like acting, and in a way, I'm still doing that. I'm in front of the camera once in a while, and
That's right. I should mention you're an MSNBC contributor. What was the best? What was the best role you ever played? What was the coolest?
Are you familiar with the play Chess?
Yes, I have
Which
never
is
seen it, but I'm
scored
familiar
by
with it.
ABBA.
Yes.
It's a really good show.
Really?
I played Anatoly in that one. That was probably my favorite production.
Which was that based on a real Russian chess player, Anatoly who?
I don't think so.
Oh,
I mean,
really?
It probably is based on like a
Right.
composite of various chess players. It's probably
So-
Kasparov in there somewhere and some others, but it was an adaptation of.
So was all ABBA songs?
Probably a composite.
So was all ABBA songs?
Yeah, well, I think ABBA did the whole score. I think it's been a long time.
What's up with ABBA and Broadway? Between that and
Sometimes you just need to smile and be a dancing queen.
I gotta tell you, I never got it with ABBA. Never understood
But just
it.
about anybody that had a performing, a record, a catalog in the 80s now is on Broadway in some form, right?
That's true.
We got Bruce. Yeah.
Bruce is off Broadway now, but yeah, Bruce.
And
is
it happens like that every 20 years. So next we're gonna have Green Day and Death Cab for Cutie musicals and whatever big thing was in the 2000s.
So I really
Maroon
wanted.
5 the musical.
God, did anybody watch the Super Bowl this week? Maroon 5.
Of course.
Oh, that was awful.
Killed.
You think they killed?
I was in a room full of kids, and I was looking down at my phone with the rest of the people who were there to watch football. But the kids, they were just loving it.
That was a super boring game, for the record. I'm not even a football fan, but that was a really boring game. Plus, I can't stand Tom Brady. Can't
Extremely
stand him.
boring.
Yeah. All right. 3 truths and a lie.
Three truths.
2 truths and a lie. Only because I have to keep my perfect record going, because I always.
I think today is the day.
Although it is the day you're a performing arts major, so
True
you
truths.
might lie to me.
My grandmother lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
Okay.
I went to Seton Hall University Law originally, and then dropped out to go to international relations program. And I used to work for a pop culture website that did more comedy than politics.
We're not talking about media aid, right? We're talking about something
No.
else. Oh, okay. All right.
I'm going with the first one. It's a lie.
My grandma?
Oh, wait a second. I'm going with the second one is a lie.
The second one is a lie.
I knew it.
That didn't go well.
I knew it.
My perfect record still stands.
Gosh.
You nailed it.
I'm telling you, nobody's ever got anything past me. It's because I have a kid. I know when they try to get away with it.
This was an extremely challenging conversation
Can I
and a
just-
very fun one.
But can I just tell you though, again, coming from an extremely liberal school, would look at your book and not agree. I would encourage people who do come from Brown and who do come from these liberal campuses to read your book.
That's true.
Thank you.
Because it allows me to either question what I believe in and why I believe it and make my arguments stronger. Or it makes me see something from a different side, have additional arguments, or change my opinion. So I think it's important, again, for people to read something that they may not pick up and be like, oh yeah, this is my gospel. It's important.
So this is a conversation that is isolated, I think, on these two political ends of the spectrum, and it's one that we probably all need to start having together.
And I will add to what Emily said, and I think people should not discount what it takes for you, and I thrived on it. I think you do too. But what a wonderful challenge it is to be able to go and talk to people who are not like-minded.
A huge opportunity and a big responsibility, and I try to take it really seriously. And a lot of the themes on these book are electrified rails,
Yeah.
and I'm tap dancing all over them. So it is a risk, but it's one that I think is important.
But best of luck with the book. Strongly urge people to read it. I thought it was a great read, and somebody who agreed with part of it, didn't agree with much of it. Emily, I think you agreed with almost none of it. But
But you know what? It forced me to think.
Yeah.
And thinking, I think in this day and age is important. It forced me to introspect. Why do I think what I believe? Okay. And then question it more. And I think that's important for anybody else. And that your book made me do that. And I appreciate
Thank you very
that.
much.
Yep.
It's a big
Thanks so much,
compliment.
Noah Rothman.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
All right, Emily, that was an absolutely awesome discussion, and I'm super psyched that we were able to have Noah on because he, again, we just had a intellectual conversation of the kind I don't think I've had since college, when you start yelling at your professors because you think you know more than they do.
It was definitely interesting. Julie, what are you salty about this week?
Well, believe it or not, I'm salty about Donald Trump, which I know is a rarity in my life, because he came out with this really sort of ridiculous tweet, and I'll just read it in full because it must be heard entirely to appreciate, and it's chutzpah-esque nature. The Dems and their committee are going quote-unquote nuts. The Republicans never did this to President Obama. There would be no time left to run government. I hear other committee heads will do the same thing, even stealing people who work at the White House, a continuation of witch hunt. So he's basically saying that all the Democrats do is investigate him, something the Republicans would never do. Mr. President, I did spend the entire Obama administration at Fox News. So let me just remind you of the things that I was forced to talk about ad nauseum every single day that the Republicans spent over a dozen committees investigating. Benghazi, I think there were at least 8 committees on that one alone. Fast and Furious, the IRS, alleged targeting of conservatives, Solyndra, the Affordable Care website. I'm probably missing a few.
His golf. Obama did golf.
Oh, and remember the big controversy over Obama wearing a tan suit, but they didn't actually do a committee launching into that. But to say that the Republicans never investigated Barack Obama, or to say that they didn't spend all their time on stuff that was completely political, would be to ignore the words of now House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who said back then, quote, "Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? But we put together a Benghazi special committee, a select committee. What are her numbers today? Her numbers are dropping." We know why they did that, and it had nothing to do with getting to the bottom of why Ambassador Chris Stevens was murdered, because I think that was something that was determined fairly quickly. It was to embarrass Hillary Clinton, which is why they forced her to testify for hours, I think 11 hours or so, ad nauseum, without a bathroom break, as I recall. So, Mr. President, I know you certainly remember that because you tweeted about it ad nauseum as well at the time, unless you obviously don't remember what you did during the Obama administration, which is even more troubling. So that's what's making me salty, the complete hypocrisy on the part of Donald Trump. What about you?
Well, So I was leaving the drugstore recently with stuff for your time of the month, and having to spend $15 a month, I remember just walking back and being very annoyed, being, men don't have to spend this ever. And it just started to multiply and explode in my head, where then I'm like, okay, also in the morning, you just think of all the makeup, all the hair supplies, how much that costs per month. And then I started thinking, I'm like, well, then there's a wage gap. And then women are expected to pay this amount of money each month just to look, professional and good at work and what society deems as you're making an effort, and then but having to spend money on things you have to anyway with just health wise. And it just started to make me very salty because
I can imagine.
because there's things are taxed more as well. And again, kind of going back to our talk even with Noah, where if he just could put himself in that position every month and just see also this extra expense that women have to pay,
what I actually noticed, and actually, I don't know if I noticed it, somebody I think pointed it out to me, and then you start to notice it, and after I say this, you will notice it too. Razors. Women's razors are marked up tremendously compared to men's razors, despite the fact that it is exactly the same product. But if they're marketed to women, they cost more. Next time you go to Duane Reade or to Walgreens or to any of your local Rite Aid, any of your local drugstores, just check out a typical Gillette razor for men and a typical Gillette razor for women, same disposable brand, and see what it costs for women versus men. And you will see that because they make the handle pink, suddenly it costs a lot more than when they make the handle blue or black. So yes, there is definitely some sort of consumer spend gap, not just a wage gap that's geared towards women.
Right.
That's incredibly annoying. I agree with you on that. And that's before we get to the cost of childcare. Katha Pollitt had a great column in the New York Times in the last week or so talking about that, how nobody's talking about universal childcare and why aren't we making that a priority. We're talking about universal college and how we can or we can't afford it, but the fact is that most people cannot afford childcare, which means that women have to stay home from work, which means that they have a harder time getting back into the workforce. Their skills aren't as kept up as men's, and that's where you see women falling behind. All right, awesome. I thought this was a great discussion with Noah. Everybody have a great week. We'll see you soon.
All right.
Bye.